Okay? If the interpreters agree? No? Yes? No? Okay, it makes more sense. And then you have the translation or? No, because I speak English, it's ridiculous. No, but the audience may speak French. It works?
Testing, can you hear us on the English channel? Testing, can you hear us? Je parle. I'm speaking. Can you hear us in the headset? They cannot hear us in the headset. Il faut dire aux techniciens, ils nous entendent pas sur le plateau là.
C'est quoi le problème?
Les casques, les gens en anglais ne nous entendent pas.
No, it's working? Mr. Kaushi, is it working?
Is it working for you? Can you give us a hands up if you can hear the interpreters speaking right now? 2, channel 2.
Does it work?
The interpreter is speaking right now. Can you raise your hand if you hear me? Ah, great. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I'm speaking. Yes, testing. 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. Testing. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Maybe that's the volume.
It don't work?
No, I can't hear it.
Okay, so I will change it. Please. Thank you very much.
This is me testing again.
Okay. This one works.
Okay, thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
Testing, testing again for the gentleman with the headset. Can you hear me? Testing, yes? Okay.
Is it working now? Good.
No, I don't think so. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Oh, what happened to it? Yes. Oh, that's a shame. Okay. Yes, I thought it was going to be him that was going to be here. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we actually stayed in the same hotel, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Good. I like to start on time. J'aime bien commencer à l'heure.
I love starting on time. It is now 2
So this
o'clock.
session, as you know, will be in English. For some of you, you'll need a translation, so you all have you're all equipped with a translation, right? And it's working. Is it working? Just raise your hand to show me it's working. Excellent. So we'll discuss a complicated and controversial topic, which is the Global South. This concept has emerged on the international scene quite recently. It's very much connected to the Ukraine war. when the northern countries or western countries, I don't know, United States and Europe, thought that southern countries or the global south would immediately support Ukraine against Russia, and it has not been the case. And we still wonder why. Maybe because in the West we are not very good at the self-criticism, and we think that we are always right, and we are surprised when other countries tell us you are not necessarily right. To debate on this, we'll have three participants who come from various parts of the world, and I think I'll ask the three of you to introduce yourself and say who you are, where you do come from, and then I will ask the three of you to define your position vis-à-vis this concept of Global South. And these will be short introductions because we'll try to have an interactive session and to answer your questions or to listen to your position. So we want to make it as interactive as possible and not an academic conference, if this is okay. Let's start from there.
Can we get them on? I mean, all three. Okay. Okay.
So you want me to go first, Guy? Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially a privilege for an American to be in Normandy, and especially with all the young minds in front of me. I started my career in my home state of Wyoming, where the Yellowstone National Park is. I worked in wildlife and forestry for a long period of time, both at the state level and then at the federal level. And then I moved into national security and foreign policy, doing work a little bit in Iraq, a lot more in Afghanistan, and a fair bit of work in Africa, Indo-Pacific, and a very little bit in Latin America. So it's truly a privilege to be with you, and I look forward to talking, hearing your question, and doing my best to answer them. Thank you very much.
Hello. It is also my privilege to be here as well. And this is such a meaningful initiative. It's always difficult to introduce yourself when asked. So I am a professor of international relations and political science in Turkey. I am from Istanbul. Currently, I am on my academic leave for a year and based in Harvard University in Boston. What I do is that I do work on foreign policy, populism, party politics, and I do think a lot about the interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy, democratic backsliding, and foreign policy changes. I think that's it. Thanks.
And you have the names on the screen anyway, so you know whom you are speaking to and what their academic background.
Okay. My name is Adekeye Adebajo. I'm from Nigeria, even though I live in South Africa. I started my career at the International Peace Academy, which is an institute that works closely with the UN. And I served on UN missions in South Africa, Western Sahara, and Iraq for 2 years. And then I headed up a Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, which was helping to build the capacity of African institutions like the African Union, ECOWAS, and SADC, and also to do research based on African researchers and thinking, interacting with Western policymakers. And I also then went to the University of Johannesburg to head up a Pan-African Institute, and now I'm a research professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Thank you.
Well, I may introduce myself very shortly. I mean, basically, I'm an economist. I taught economics in Paris at Sciences Po during 30 years, and then at Stanford in California. And now I happen to be the chair of the Humanities Department and the Maison Française, which is a major cultural center at New York University. And in agreement with La Région Normandie, we have decided to organize a series of debates on international affairs. And we started this first debate on the Global South. The first debate took place in New York, at New York University, at La Maison Française. And today is a kind of a continuation of this process. Will go on for a year and maybe more. So this is just a step in the process and not just a one-time shot. Okay? I think we can keep the same order. So, Couch, when I say Global South, what do you say? You scream? You?
No, I think I don't scream at all. Instead of being an academic, I look at things more as a public policy practitioner. So people have the right to call them whatever they do. And so if folks want to say Global South, that's fine. It's a different iterations of third world or developing world or emerging world, whichever way, or BRICS or something, our version of it, which is perfectly okay. The question which poses here is that does it has to force us to rethink peace? My thought is no. I don't know why we would have to rethink peace. It applies everywhere. But what we do need to do is to move away from a Eurocentric view to perhaps a more balanced and equitable view. So if an attack by Russia on Ukraine threatens the global world order, so does an attack in any African nation by one or the other, or internal issues, or any other part of the world. And I think we do take it a little asymmetric view of it. So obviously people, you shouldn't be that surprised when people react differently and say, when it happens to you, the world falls apart. When it happens to me, nobody really notices as much. And I think that needs to be addressed. I think the question less of peace to me, more is about, especially America and Europe, have been slow to both react and adapt to the economic aspirations, particularly in Africa. I think certainly in Indo-Pacific, Asia, and a little bit less to degree in Latin America, but we still view it as a relationship, as more of a development project. We look at from a development lens, some sort of a human rights or something of that end, as opposed to an appreciation of a equal partner on economic and security issues, just like we do Europe, just like we do more so in Indo-Pacific, and to perhaps a little less in our Western Hemisphere or Latin America. So this sort of equitable nature of paying attention to everybody, not just when it happens in Europe, I think that's something we all need to get used to. What does that mean? How does this translate on several levels, from climate change to security to other elements? I think I'll love to have question answers from you, and I won't talk any more on that topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Couch.
Okay, let me start from what I understand from the concept of Global South. I mean, when I first was a student as an international relations student back in the 1990s, that was right after the Cold War. And we were basically using the concept of Global South as a reflection of global inequality, right? There were rich countries in the north and there were poorer countries in the south. So that changed, and that really changed the meaning of the Global South. So beginning of the 2000s, what we have is that the inequality among nations is now less as compared to inequality within the nations. So there are emerging countries who are getting more from the global wealth, and they're basically asking more power, status, prestige in the global world order. So when I talk about Global South, I am basically referring to these countries like South Africa, like Turkey, like Brazil, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, which are basically gaining more, right? Extracting more from the global resources, becoming more powerful, both in terms of soft power and hard power, and they are asking for more prestige. And the second thing that when I do talk about Global South, I do think that we have to basically refer to this competition between the United States and the EU, or maybe you can call largely, I mean broadly, more broadly, political West, because it's not geographical anymore. And on the other side of the competition, you have China and Russia. The competition is not about only economic. The competition is not just economic competition. It's also a normative competition over democracy, over values, and this and that. And there are a block of countries, which we can also call Global South, who doesn't want to really get aligned with either bloc. For my own country, Turkey, I mean, Turkey is basically a country which is aligned, which is within the institutionalized West, which is a member of NATO, which is a EU candidate country, but still identifies itself as a global South or an emerging power. So the puzzle I have here is, for example, why a country like that, Turkey, right, which is in the institutionalized West, which is a member of NATO, still identifies itself as part of the Global South? And the answer that I have this question is, first, I already stated, it is basically Turkey is within the group of countries that is asking more power, more prestige, more status, and aligns with other countries that does this. And second, what I do think that is one of the major common characteristics of the Global South countries right now is that they are challenged towards the West-led international order, be it financial, be it on the basis of representation, be it on the basis of recognition and this and that. So they are disdain from the West-led international order, or be it the American hegemony, is really what unites these countries ideologically, I think. And I'll stop here.
Chair, can I just ask for a clarification?
Of course.
Because we heard your former Turkish foreign minister in the plenary, and he was talking about Turkey being part of the West. So I'm not quite understanding the political schizophrenia.
Okay, Turkey also applied to the BRICS in the beginning of this year, in 2024. Turkey is also sort of an observer in the Shanghai organization as well. So it really wants to have this more flexible strategic autonomy when it comes to foreign policy. But what I do think is that when you look at Turkey's behavior, foreign policy behavior in different conflicts, for example, let's consider the conflict in Ukraine. Turkey is basically aligned with NATO, and it basically considers itself as the part of the West, right? Political West and institutional West. And the alignment is definitely there. Maybe not in economic terms, because there's no, I mean, Turkey is now observing the EU sanctions. But when you look at, for example, other conflicts, Syrian conflict, Gaza conflict, all regional conflicts, when the West is not directly, or NATO is not directly part of it, there is no foreign policy alignment there. So you see a lot of divergence, and it really depends on the crisis, cohesion of the alliance, and this and that. So that's one part of the explanation. Different foreign policy crises or foreign policy events basically create different responses in Turkish foreign policy. But other part is, like all these other countries, Turkey had, throughout its modern history probably, had this very conflictual and ambivalent relationship with the idea of the West, right? So initially, throughout the 20th century, it was basically more an adaptive response. We would like to become a part of the West. We should be recognized as a part of the West. But in the last 2 years, it has become more of a competitive behavior, I would say, right? We are a unique culture. We have our own values. We are different from you, and we are going to cooperate with you as long as our interests and values align. And when they diverge, we'll diverge, as in the case of Gaza, for example.
Okay, so I think it's important to historicize the debate. Where does the Global South come from? The Global South comes from the attempt of developing countries which were previously colonized by European states to regain their independence. So in 1955, there was a conference in Bandung, which is in Indonesia. And that conference was mainly Asian states and a few African states, about 29 of them. and they basically sought to regain their sovereignty from the West, to gain their independence, to end racism, to assert their equality. And 6 years later, the non-aligned movement was formed in 1961 in former Yugoslavia. And Tito, the president, was one of the key founders. And some of the other founders were Nehru of India, Nasser of Egypt, Nkrumah of Ghana, and Suharto of Indonesia as well. And what I think separates the Global South is, or what unites them rather, is they had a political and economic unity to basically try to fight for equality. And there are three key principles, I think, that the non-aligned movement as the embodiment of the Global South had. One is that you're not meant to have any military alliances with NATO, the Warsaw Pact, or any. You're not actually meant to have any military bases on your territory. The second key issue is that you're actually going to support institutions of global governance like the UN. So if the US or the Soviet Union is violating the UN, you actually have to support the UN and the principle of international global governance. That's another key issue. And then the third issue, I think, is regional autonomy, which was pushed most strongly by Suharto in Indonesia, which means that we want to be able to make decisions that affect our regions on our own without external actors like the US and Soviet Union or France or whoever waging proxy wars and supporting different groups to fuel conflicts. So I think that's mainly the idea. And then in the economic field, the idea of a new economic international order was pushed from the 1970s by the Global South in the non-aligned movement and the Group of 77 and China within the United Nations. And they were asking for things like technology transfer, industrialization, etc. But that did not actually succeed. My last point, a lot of the Global South is not monolithic. Some of the countries aren't even south of the equator. So it's more of a political than a geographical term. And some of the countries also had military bases. You know, France had military bases in some of the countries of the non-aligned movement. Soviet Union was in a military alliance with Cuba. So they weren't necessarily observing that, which is why I was also trying to push Turkey. Because India, which had been one of the strongest countries in the non-aligned movement, is now singing a tune of multi-alignment. So India has lunch with the BRICS partners, and then at night, under the cover of darkness, it's actually colluding with the US in an anti-China Indo-Pacific group, which I think is more opportunism. So that's why I was trying to push Turkey as well. Can you really be part of the South and the West at the same time? Are you not trying to eat from too many tables?
If I may, I would like to add some remarks which are focused on France. What is the position of France in this debate on the Global South? Clearly, France does not belong to the Global South, okay? But there always has been a tradition in France to be more or less non-aligned. In the time of General de Gaulle, it's less true today, but France is still not very much at ease in being totally aligned with the United States. Okay? So this is one of the specific dimensions of French foreign policy. Second observation, which is I think more important and up to date, is that the French has yet to recognize that they have been a colonizing nation and that colonization by the French in Africa or in Asia was not such a nice affair. We, the French, we like to believe that we brought civilization to Africa. And this is what we still hear, that we still learn at school. And President Macron created quite a shock when in Africa, it was in Burkina Faso 3 years ago, he said the colonization of Africa by the French has been a crime against humanity. This was an extraordinary declaration and which was not sufficiently commented. And another sign of France, little by little, recognizing that we have been a colonizing nation, and so that there are some reason why the global south doesn't like us, as we can see right now in Africa, where the French have been expelled from Mali, from Burkina Faso, and our relationship with Senegal are not that good these days. And so we begin a process of recognizing that we did hurt the global south, and if the global south doesn't like us, there are some good reasons behind that. You know that beyond Macron's declaration, we try to rebuild our cultural and historical relationship with Algeria, recognizing little by little that the colonization of Algeria was not a very nice affair. French Museum are giving back to Benin some art. We consider them art in Benin. They consider that a religious object, okay? And we send back to Benin some objects which have been plundered by the French during the colonization. So as we are in France and we are French, I mean, there is a specific dimension in this debate on the France vis-à-vis the global south, and the work, historical, cultural work that we have to do to recognize what has been our role or responsibility in the emergence of this concept of global south. That's it for now. I mean, the rule of the game, if it works, if it doesn't, we'll adapt. I mean, in the audience, some of you do want to intervene or ask questions? The answer is yes, but I don't see any hand rising. Allez, un effort.
If you were in my class, I would be pointing fingers right now.
Yes. Even stupid questions are accepted. No, students or teachers, because we have teachers as well as students. Monsieur, alors, madame, je vous vois à peine, pardon, et monsieur après.
First the lady and then the gentleman.
So I've got a question about what you just said about France
Vous
trying...
pouvez parler en français, c'est traduit si vous préférez. Hein?
Okay. I still rather speak in English directly to the panel. So you just asked the question, you just spoke of France's efforts to try and repair, to construct a better relationship with its partners in Africa. You cited, for example, our effort of giving back artifacts to countries like Benin. Have we been alone in doing this? And because I assume we haven't. And has France done anything unique, shown a particular enthusiasm in doing so, or is this just a more general trend? Thank you.
Enthusiasm would be a strong word. There is a lot of reluctance, mostly coming from museums. And because museums consider that those are art objects and that the African countries are not equipped to preserve these art objects. They don't have the museums, they don't have the right places, and to go against this argument, several countries like Benin and Senegal, for example, built modern museums which are able to accept this work of art, but it is a strong trend. It is a strong trend. I mean, all French museums now have the obligation to explain the origin of what they show, and if they can't explain the origin, if some treaty has not been respected, they'll be legally forced to send this back. Enthusiasm, no, but a strong trend, yes. Now, this trend is understood as part of repairing the harm done by colonization. Of course not. I mean, history is history and you cannot rewrite it. Monsieur?
Can we also, sorry, I just want to add something. I think it's also important to put it in a broader context. Countries like Belgium, Italy, Germany have also, and Britain most importantly, have also had to return colonial artifacts. And one of the things I think is important about the German case is that I don't know whether many of you know, there was a genocide committed by the Germans in Namibia, which was the first genocide of the 20th century between 1904 and 1908 in their colony of Southwest Africa. And that led to the destruction and disappearing of about 80% of the Hammer and 50% of the Nama. Many people actually think this, many historians portray this as a dress rehearsal for the Nazi genocide, which happened 2 decades later, basically. And in that particular case, there were concentration camps as well that were set up in Namibia, and many of the Hama and Nama were massacred, and some of the others were put in concentration camps. And there were also experiments with skulls and things like that. And many of those skulls have now had to be returned to Namibia. They were being displayed in museums in Germany, some of them, and they've basically had to do a proper burial. So it's very important we not just look at just the history of colonialism, but let's look at the history of slavery as well, because colonialism was only a sequel to slavery. And not many French people probably know that 2 million slaves were transported to the Americas and the Antilles and the Caribbean with French ships by basically French slavers. So all of that history is important also to put in context.
Thank you.
Let me take a shot at it too, since we have it. You know, it's not just between developing third global south and whatever the alternative is. That's why I don't much care for the term per se, because then it presumes there's a global north. And perhaps, I don't know who here wants to be part of global north nowadays. But the notion is, so the frames come up, and I think, let me ask you one more thing so that you ask me more questions. So the most known issue is between UK and Greece, dealing with Elgin marbles. Recently, like last week, when you had the UN meeting and the Quad meeting, America was sort of returning some of Indian artifact back to India. I think that's more to do as a symbolic nature than a real issue. But you've seen some trends come up here in the terms of global south. I think you've heard a lot about the colonial history, the racism part of it. That is certainly one element. There's also the economic aspiration side of it. So one can take these various sort of slogans that come through. If you are cynical about them, you would see that these are slogans largely to improve your negotiating sort of position. Play one against the other, say, I'm not in your team, I'm not in your team, I don't want to be in anybody's team, but I want your technology transfer, I want your money, why don't you give it to me, and I want to be alone, and I want to tell you that you are wrong. So that's one element of it. And I think that's a cynical view, but there is certainly, you can find truths within it or see where you come from. The other side is that, hey, I have real economic aspirations. You guys went through an economic system and process. I also want to go through industrialization. I also have a rising middle class. I also want to have an economic growth rate of 3, 4, 5%. And when I do it, I'm looking for partners And I'm really looking for equal partners of respect rather than lectures on human rights and social issues that you give me. Work with me to do an economic job. So there are these two broad themes. Within that, Global South and these big names come up. There are a lot more. There's BRICS. There's also, if you have a Global South, and with China and India at the moment are competing among each other, who's going to be the leader of Global South? You have Mr. Suharto and ASEAN. So there's several elements. So without getting in too hooked up on either the history or the elements of saying how and what, you take a country one by one, respect them as much, look at what the economic issues are, and treat them with respect and treat them equally and see where we can go with it. So I think that's an important theme, and it would be good to bring that about in question and answers rather than me lecturing and giving you a long history about how and where there are inconsistencies and consistencies and diversions on non-aligned movement, how many of non-aligned movement countries were actually non-aligned, how much they were in line with one camp or the other back then and even now. So all these things are fine, but how do we deal with them and deal with them much better than we have done in the past? That's a challenge in front of us. And I think it's good to figure out, without chasing slogans, how to do it.
Thank you, Carl. Does there was une question, monsieur? Un micro, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Pour plus de précision, je la poserai en français.
I will ask my question in French.
Évidemment, j'ai appris à l'école.
Of course, I learned at school the word third world. I learned about third world and global south at school, but why did we give up the expression third world and replaced it with the south, the global south? I can understand that third world has a connotation of war, of poverty in the West, but the word third world also carries in it another aspect when we are looking for a new way beyond the non-alignment of politics or the break with the West. And I was just wondering, why should we have another term such as the Global South rather than find a new way of using the old term of the Third World?
Okay. So as I was trying to explain in the beginning of the talk, the third world basically was a concept, and that was also within your question, that third world was a concept that really belonged to Cold War, right? And it really assumed that there is this difference in a hierarchy between the nations, and the difference came, or the initiation of the concept of the Global South came both from the countries of the Global South, however defined, and also coming from the academia, who basically argued that this is a very colonial and a hierarchical concept, because it assumes that there is a first world and at the third world, and that really is within itself a sort of a hierarchy. So that's part of it, right? Decolonizing the concepts that we are using, and it's basically historically a very Cold War concept, and that goes with what we just talked in the non-aligned movement of the 1960s, 70s. Third world was larger, was broadly used and was more oftenly used. But right after the Cold War, we basically shifted towards this concept of Global South, which is more inclusive. But then we do have more problems with the concept of Global South, and we all basically pointed out to those problems. What really is the Global South, or whether there is a Global South? How are we going to define the Global South based on, there's a lot of divergence within the Global South countries. There is a lot of institutional divergence. There are some democratic countries, authoritarian countries. There's a lot of economic divergence as well. There are some wealthy countries, less developed countries. There is a lot of divergence in terms of alignment behavior as well, right? There are non-aligned countries, and there are countries like Turkey, which considers itself as a part of the Global South, which is very, in terms of security alliances, institutional umbrellas or security umbrellas, very different from the global south. So the concept itself has become a political battlefield. How to define it, whether we are part of it. So I think when defining global south, we may really rely on more flexible concepts, right, and a more flexible definition. And it's better to identify what is the battlefield here. What are we trying to say or indicate when we say global south? And as I said, when we say global south, I think very vaguely, very broadly, what really unites this country is this problem with the Western, with the hierarchy, right? They, as you were saying, they are basically asking, all these countries are basically asking redistribution of the economic wealth, global wealth. They are basically asking for more recognition, and they are basically asking for more representation in the global institutions. And that was correct for Turkey, as well as it was correct for many African countries, although they are, significantly, radically different from each other. But the demands that they are making from the international system, order, liberal international order or not, however you define, is pretty much similar. And I have this idea that maybe we should define the global south on the basis of demand making, right? Not on the basis of their characteristics, or their shared characteristics of these countries. What are they asking from the global order? Maybe the battle is really around that idea.
I have to react to this one. And then I would request my own panelist, because he studied history more than I have. So first of all, you said, why are we using these terms? So first of all, we have no right. Countries have right to choose what they say. So it's exactly like my good friend said. The third world come out of the term as he referred to the meeting that happened in Asia soon after World War I. Then they decided to do non-alignment. And exactly like he said, there were different groups within. Let's close it. Okay. All right. And so it echoes in my ears now, but anyway. First of all, it's not for me or us. I think that we should learn that. People are right to do anything. Second, I don't know of any concept of global south. It's an academic exercise to define it. I don't see any country tripping over each other to define it. They use it when it's helpful. They don't use it when it's not helpful. We can say, a good friend just said about, certainly Kenya is an important global south country. He would think so. It's also recently a major non-NATO ally. Most of the Indo-Pacific countries, all the way from Philippines, Vietnam, down to Papua New Guinea, to a lot of Pacific islands, are very important global south countries. They have very strong defense agreements. So my good friend here relayed out the important three themes that global south looking for. That's what Turkey's looking for. Recognition, stature, all those things. It may be very different from what Angola is looking for, or what Namibia is looking for right now. And so we're putting words into a place where it's fine as an academic exercise, what it is. But when I engage with a country, which I do a fair bit when I was in government, nobody says, I'm here as a member of the Global South, deal with me. They said, if anything, their local association, whether it be ASEAN in particular, one of the regional elements I would talk about, or the various organizations, East, West, South, SADC, or EAC within Africa. So I think it's useful to keep in mind they were trying to give a sort of a monolithical homogeneity to this idea because of an academic exercise, and we didn't fit very well in third world, like you mentioned. It didn't fit very well in non-aligned movement. It didn't sure as heck fit very well in G77. And it doesn't fit very well today in Global South either. But we can talk about it. Makes for good panel discussions.
My answer is much more simple. The first world was the West. The second world was Eastern Europe and the Soviet-led bloc. And the third world was more or less the rest, Africa, Latin America, Asia. The Cold War ended and the Second World disappeared. So obviously, third world loses its utility.
Question, oui. Micro ici et là-bas, deux questions.
Moi, ma question, elle parle plus de l'émergence de l'Afrique.
My question is about the emergence of Africa, and I was wondering if, according to you, Africa could develop, emerge, and to do so, must it separate from the Western world? Because with neo-colonialism, there's a certain dependency between the states and a forced dependence, an exploitation of African land by France, Europe, and even the United States. So for Africa to develop globally and with Pan-Africanism or a union of these African countries, should it separate from Europe? As Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who wanted to become independent, he wanted African independence. Do we need to create a union with the Western world or not?
Thank you very much. I think it's a really excellent question. You know, you had a very famous French-Egyptian scholar called Samir Amin. And in the 1970s, they were calling for delinkage, for Africa to delink from the rest of the world and form its own autonomous development. My personal view is that it's not realistic. The world is so globalized now that it's not really an option to delink from global supply chains and all sorts of things like that. I think it's also important to note that Africa's largest trading partner today is not the West, it's China. The trade between China and Africa is now $280 billion. And China builds about a third, 33%, of Africa's infrastructure. And so you have a new situation. The other thing that's important even about China, China is now the second largest economy in the world. It's the largest trading partner of 120 countries. It has a Belt and Road initiative that's building infrastructure, trying to create a new Silk Road across the world involving 135 countries. And if you look at China's own development, you see that China did not delink with the rest of the world. It rather used Western technology and companies to develop its own economy and become the second largest economy in the world. But it negotiated with those Western companies from a position of strength, having a market of 1.4 billion people. And it ignored a lot of the advice from the World Bank and IMF and basically did its own state-led development because it knew what it wanted. And today, China is the only country in history that has lifted 400 million people out of poverty. So I think it's important that we try to draw those kinds of lessons as well. I also think, by the way, we have lessons to learn from the European Union. You know, I'm a big admirer of both Jean Monnet and Jacques Delors, who are the two Frenchmen that really were the architects of, first of all, the European Economic Community and then the European Union. And the European Union was set up initially basically to prevent war between France and Germany, and was an exchange between French agriculture and German steel. But eventually what it's been able to do is unite a continent of 320 million people, and intra-European trade now is about 60 to 70%. Intra-African trade is 14%. So we're getting stuff out of the ground, minerals and all sorts of resources, and we're not adding value to it so that we can turn cocoa into chocolate and then export it. We're just exporting the raw materials. So there are lessons I think we should take from everywhere, But I think what we need to do is use the presence of China as our largest trading partner to get better deals from the Western investors that are in Africa. But it's not realistic to cut yourself off from the rest of a globalized world.
Thank you very much. My name is Tanguy Moulin. I have a specific question to Professor Adebayo. Thank you for what you are saying, because this is very illustrating for us. And here we are here to try to better understand the fundamentals of the global south and the drivers and the imaginary. So I'd like to come back on Namibia. And please excuse me if I make a lot of mistakes on Namibia. You are 100 times better than me, but I just want to understand exactly the way we might think differently so that we better understand each other. So you mentioned shortly Namibia and Germany, and you made a direct link between colonialism and slavery. So if I go shortly to Namibia, with a little bit more of history, Namibia at first was a land for the Khoi people, but then the Bantu Herero came and colonialized that region before the Dutch to come and before the Germans. The Germans came only in 1884 to make it a colony. First point. If I look at the Damara, who had been put into slavery by the Herero. So my point to say, colonialism has been in Namibia by the Germans. There have been slavery in Namibia, but colonialism and slavery were not only a European fact, it's something which has been existed under different patterns. And there has been slavery, there has been European colonialism, but there was a long time between them. But so, despite all this, you made a focus directly between Namibia, Germany, colonialism, and So my question is really to know, to understand why this is a point you pointed out, and not a different one. This is to better understand your point of view.
Okay, thank you very much. If I understood you correctly, in terms of the points you're trying to make, I'm not trying to say that the transatlantic slave trade is the first example of slavery. The name slavery itself comes from Slav. So this is a European phenomenon that has existed for a very long time. I'm also not saying that there wasn't slavery in different parts of Africa, but I think the transatlantic slave trade was of a completely different order. You know, when you would have slavery in African societies, there could be different groups that would fight wars against each other and do raids and capture slaves, but those slaves were not chained and made to work for nothing. They were not killed and raped endlessly in their millions. Their fertility was not controlled in this, and this did not go on also for 4 centuries in the way that the transatlantic slave trade did. I mean, the numbers you're talking about with the transatlantic slave trade is 12 to 15 million people. They were taken in totally degrading circumstances. About a quarter of them died on the slave ship. Many of them were raped on the slave ships by white masters. Many of them were raped when they got to the Americas as well. And they were not allowed to practice their own religions. They were not allowed to speak their own languages. They were not allowed to have any access to literacy, reading or writing. That is of a completely different order as what happened in domestic African slavery, where there was actually even opportunities for social mobility and even intermarriage in some of those systems. The Arab slave trade took place for much longer and was also quite a brutal slave trade as well. But I would argue that the transatlantic slave trade that happened between the 15th century and the 19th century was the most brutal form of slavery and one of the most humiliating acts that we've seen in the whole of history. And in terms of the whole Khoi and Khoisan and etc., I'm not saying that there weren't groups that fought wars and conquered each other. Of course, we had empires in Africa as well. You had the Oyo Empire, you had the Songhai Empire, you had the Ghana Empire. But the fact still remains that Germans went uninvited into Southwest Africa. They stole the land and cattle of the people who lived there. And when those people tried to resist, there was a genocide that was perpetrated against them. So those are facts that you cannot deny historically. And I don't think it's a good idea when people are talking of atrocities to kind of point to other incidents. You know, you can't, if you're a thief, be running away and someone arrests you and you point to someone else and say, but he's also a thief. I don't think that's a very good way of argumentation.
Yeah, so I think there's truth in both of what you're saying. This is why for young students, it's a complicated business. So I would have a plea to you. You have two choices. One can look at history, and one should always look at history because you need to be informed in your reasoning. And we can rehash it, and there are different points of view, and it's enough. Or we can look in the future and say, where do we want to, what's the relationship we want going forward? And one of the things we really want to, in this day and age where we have a lot of virtue signaling, we make ourselves better for doing something distant from somebody else. It was implied in your question a little bit that somehow Africa would be better off without American or Western engagement. That has never been true for anybody through history. It hasn't been true, and as my good friend mentioned, China is a good example. So as Africa looks at it and thinks that making a deal, my good friend said it should learn from China. It also should be careful with China when it deals with business as well. So it's not just the Western world that do it. So again, going back and forth on all of these issues, it'll be confusing. We can talk through here, three of us, on like 17 different aspects of everything. But I think a positive, optimistic view of future, the world has never been better. Never been happier, luckier in many ways. We got more wars, yes, we have more diseases, but we have more solutions to all of those. So I would really like to see from you guys, what is the vision that we form in the future based on equality, respect for each other's views without saying I am better than you because of X, Y, Z, whether I'm from global south or global north. We didn't talk, it's not our job to look down, and sure as hell, nothing from global south that they get in a moral superiority and look down on north either. So I think we look at equal and we see how we shape the future together. I would urge you to focus on that and less on angst. I think that's never been good for most people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Avon, want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, not to this latest debate on colonialism, but about the linking from the West in Africa, the debate on that. And as you were pointing out, that China has become the major investor in Africa, alongside with countries like Turkey. When I look at the figures, for example, in 2005, the trade between Turkey and Africa in general was like $6 billion something. And in only 20 years, it was like $41 billion in the beginning of 2020. So there's a huge increase in terms of trade between Turkey and African countries in general. I mean, concentrated in some specific countries, but as the continent, if you look at the continent-wise trade, it really increased significantly. And the majority of that increase is also coming from this collaboration between Chinese companies in Turkey, specifically in infrastructural projects, construction projects, and this and that. And sometimes this debate takes us to a more narrow debate, or a narrower debate, where countries like Turkey are called not a part of the global south, but sort of sub-imperial countries, now working in countries like Africa, right? Partnering with China, and basically without having this colonial ties or history like the Western countries have, and having really cultural ties with some Muslim majority African countries. So they become very influential actors, right? But they also consider themselves as part of this larger project of the Global South. And that takes me back to this question that you were saying, or the concept that you were referring to, eating from many plates. So, I mean, you do see that case in Africa too, but I do wonder that whether it has become, as we were also pointing at, the zeitgeist of our times. You can do it by using this different concept opportunities in an opportunist way, right? So I just wanted to point out to the fact that it's like these new countries with new sorts of partnerships under the guise of collaboration of Global South are now investing in countries or in Africa as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Questions? Yes? Yes, yes.
Oui, merci. Merci. Je voulais juste rajouter quelque chose.
Thank you. I also wanted to add something to what has just been said regarding the return of artifacts. I saw the documentary 2 days ago, a documentary rather, or film, a fiction rather, that talked about the transfer of these artifacts, and it mentioned the 3 kings, and we see in the movie the reaction of the population. This was just a piece of information that could be of interest for some. One question. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the quality of this debate. I've not heard about the word religion. Is this on purpose? Is this on purpose? You have not mentioned religion. We're talking about economy. We're talking about money. It's important about economic development. But what about religion? Is this not a barrier to alignment or non-alignment? That's my question, really. We're going to take a number of questions. We will answer all the questions, of course, but we are going to ask all the questions first.
Oui, monsieur, là, devant moi.
Est-ce que pour vous, la Chine pourrait, en tant que leader,
could China, as a leader in the global south,
d'ici une vingtaine d'années,
in the next 20 years, overtake the US, economically speaking, and take the lead? Are we looking for a prophet here rather than an academic to answer this question? Okay. Please ask your question.
A few minutes ago, you talked about the relation between France and some African countries like Mali or Burkina Faso. We say that you say that relation between them is people don't like France. We say that France, but don't you think that is the hate about the concept of France Afrique and not the hate about the France? So that is my question.
Okay, that's a question for me, I guess. Monsieur? Au fond.
So I had a question regarding China and its activity in African countries or in the global south globally. We talked a lot about Africa, but I think we're leaving out a few other countries, maybe in Latin America, also in Asia. Haven't talked a lot about those countries. Globally, Africa. China has been now a very important actor, maybe taking the Western place in Africa and global South countries. So I'd like to know, what are we thinking about that? Could they be taking the entire role of Western countries and maybe being their new master, because they've been investing a lot. So investments come with obviously debt, and how can you pay back the debt? And I'd like to know, and maybe could that be leading to another Cold War against, I know, been seeing a lot of proxy wars and countries backing up a side. We've seen that in Russia and in Ukraine. We've seen that in the Gaza war. I'd like to have some more information about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Monsieur devant, oui. Hop. Écoutez, comme il est à poser des questions.
Because of the time, please ask short questions, will you?
Vous avez essayé de trouver des, je ne sais plus si c'est le mot, mais des critères
You
communs
try to find common criteria to define the global south or the various countries from the global south, but in your answers, we are hearing things like equality,
l'égale dignité, peut-être.
respect of dignity.
Mais la question que je me pose,
But
c'est
the question I'm asking,
le Sud global
is the global
va
south
sortir le monde
going
d'un
to
système
take
de
the world
dominance
out of a system of
et de
domination
dominer
between the dominee and the
prédation,
dominer, and a system of the one
autrement,
dominating
est-ce
and the
qu'on
one being
va
dominated, rather?
vers l'universel
And rather, are we
en
going
passant par le
towards
Sud
something
global
universal by going through
qu'on
the global
écouterait?
south that we would now listen to?
Ce qui veut dire que tout simplement, il faut retrouver
Meaning
du concret.
that we need to find
des
something
textes,
practical and concrete.
Cite simplement l'article 1
I'm
de la
just
Déclaration
quoting
universelle
Article
des droits
1
de
of the
l'homme.
Universal
Tous les
Declaration
êtres
of Human
humains
Rights. All
naissent
human
libres
beings
et égaux en
are born
dignité
free
et en
and
droit.
equal in dignity
Ils
and
sont
in
dotés de
rights,
raison et de conscience
etc.
et doivent agir
And they
dans un esprit de
must act
fraternité.
in a spirit of
Donc, est-ce qu'on va
brotherhood.
vers cet
So are we
universel
going
ou est-ce qu'on
towards
crée
that, toward that
un monde qui
universality,
va se
or are we
renouveler
creating a world
en prédation?
that will turn into a predator again? Another question, last two questions, please.
Non, les trois dernières.
Last three questions. Try to make short questions, please.
Du coup, ma question, c'était de savoir comment est-ce que les pays du Sud global
How do the countries from the global south can contribute to peace when every of these countries have different religion, different behavior, different cultures and customs, and they can't even get on together? So how can these countries in the global south can contribute to the to world peace when there will actually be never any peace between these countries?
Oui, monsieur.
Il y a des pays plus du nord qui interviennent dans des guerres comme
There are countries from the north
Et je voudrais savoir,
involved in the Palestinian conflict, and I'd like to ask you, what is your opinion regarding the intervention of countries from the north regarding wars, especially the war in Palestine? I did not understand the question, sorry, can you repeat, says Mr. Sorman. How do we get peace with the intervention of countries from the north in the southern countries, for example, in Africa? There are conflicts. So how can the North help when there is conflicts in the South, basically? One more question. Yes, hello. I just wanted to ask you, do you know why it took so much time for the West to start asking itself or to start questioning the damage caused by the slave trade and by colonialism? Why it took so long, and why are we only just asking these questions now? What is at stake is not recent, it's been there for a long time, but how come we only think of this now? Okay, let's try to answer all these questions. I will answer one particular question.
Is there an hostility from the African people in countries like Mali or Burkina Faso against France and French culture? Or is it only against a system which has been called France-Afrique, where after decolonization or so-called decolonization, actually French economic and military interests in collaboration with the local leader continue the colonization under another name, okay? And the answer is easy and complicated. It's true that decolonization never went very far, and it is true that most of the African leaders in former African French colonies were supported, financed by the French government, and it is true that the French military went on after independence in 1962, considering that this country were still their backyard. So what we see is, interestingly enough, a kind of a reaction, not on the generation of independence, but of the second generation, the children of the generation of the independence, discovering that they are not totally free, but they are under the pressure of the French and of their own governments in alliance with the French government. So it's mostly a young people revolution against French influence. Do they make a distinction between this French post-colonial system and French culture, for example? It's not clear. For example, if you take Senegal, which traditionally is the African country which was the closest to France, Senegal sent members of parliaments in the 18th century. If you go to Senegal, you will discover that Senegalese students, more and more, they go and study in the United States and not in France anymore. And this is true in several former French colonies. So I think that the rebellion against French post-colonialism is also a rebellion against French culture, and that France is losing ground, not only as a military and economic power, but also as a cultural power in the former African colonies. And we say, who lost China? I mean, that's what you say in the United States. I do think that France is losing Africa. That's the situation right now. And it's interesting, I mentioned Macron's speech in Ouagadougou, saying colonization was a crime against mankind. The reaction from the students, he was speaking at the university, reaction from the students was very negative. In a way, they say, too late, too late. That's the situation right now. No. On China, I don't know. Who wants the...
You decide on the order. Maybe age before beauty.
Let's start that way. Let's start that way.
Okay. Thank you very much. I actually have my own mic.
Oh, okay.
Let me use my mic. Thank you very much. Really excellent questions, and I'm so glad that we're now beginning to hear from the audience, because this is really the preferred format to engage. I think in terms of religion, it's true. Religion is a very important issue in many of these societies, and it's one of the most important cross-cutting cleavages. In Africa, for example, which I know best, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are wreaking havoc all over the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, even down to Mozambique and Cabo Delgado. There are Islamist groups there. So this definitely is an important issue when it comes to the global south and trying to tackle the challenges of the global south. And it's certainly something that we're focusing on when we're looking at conflict resolution. Religion, of course, is also very big in Africa. I mean, I see all of these beautiful churches here, like the Abbey we're in, the cathedral here, and in Rouen, where I was many years ago. And the churches in Europe seem to be museums now. Not many people seem to be going to churches anymore in Europe. But in Africa, religion is growing and growing and growing. And it's the Pentecostal churches and charismatic churches. My personal view is that sometimes these churches are actually preventing action against governments because they tend to be very conservative. They're preaching more prosperity gospel than liberation theology. So, but that's a personal view. Will China overtake the US? We've been hearing that China is due to overtake the US within the next 10 or 20 years. Whether it will happen or not, I'm not sure. The US is still at the moment quite a way ahead of China. The US is 26 trillion in terms of its economy. It accounts for 26% of the world's GDP. China is at about 18.5 trillion. And China is bigger than all 27 EU countries put together. But the US is still much larger than that. I think at some point China, due to size and all sorts of other things, will eventually overtake the US. But I don't think that the US's decline will be, total. The US won't suddenly slip in the way that Britain and France have slipped to number 5 and 6, or number 6 and 7. The US will remain in the top 2. And I think the edge that the US has over China is that the US has innovation and dynamism. So the most dynamic tech companies in the world, Microsoft and Google and Apple and all of those, are still coming out of the US. And the US still accounts today for 39% of military spending in the world. Its spending is more than the next 20 countries combined. So if the US declines, it will be a relative decline. And the problem I see with China is that it's an autocratic system. And what Xi Jinping has done by establishing a cult of personality and one-man rule, basically a president for life, I think for me is very negative, because it will make China less attractive and it will make it less innovative, because there isn't really that much freedom of speech and soft power that can attract a lot of other countries to it. In terms of the question of France Afrique, I think you're quite right, my brother. For me, we have nothing against French people, those of us that detest France Afrique. What we hate is the policy itself. I wouldn't be here if I was anti-French. So the opposition to France Afrique is the fact that France has for 50 years launched 50 military interventions into Africa, and it's tended to support dictators like Idriss Deby, like Eyadema, like Mobutu Sese Seko, like Bokassa. It hasn't been to promote democracy. And a lot of French companies are seen to have exploited Africa. For example, your uranium companies in Niger, and a lot of the agreements that was negotiated after independence basically gave a lot of French companies, Bouygues, CFAO, and others, a monopoly in many of the markets like Gabon and other countries in which France was ruling before. That needs to change, and we now need to have something where African countries are run in the interest of those countries, and France can, of course, be a player, but you can no longer exploit Africa militarily, economically, and politically. That's what we want to end. But we have nothing against actual French people. I think that a lot of French people aren't even aware of what a lot of these elites have been doing in Africa, just like Americans, you know. Americans thought they were the most generous people. Whenever there's a crisis in the world, Americans are always the first to contribute and to give. And they were so shocked with 9/11 because suddenly they realized what some of the rest of the world thought of their policies. So we separate your reckless elites from the actual people themselves. And that's why it's important we have these kinds of debates. I think the other question was domination. and the global south, can it stop the domination of the north? I think it's important we try anyway. We heard about the levels of inequality in the world yesterday or this morning, where 1% control like 40% of the world's wealth. That has to end. That is not a sustainable situation if we want peace and some kind of order in the world. But what I am skeptical about with the BRICS control about 46% of the population and maybe 36% of the GDP of the world. But I don't really see the BRICS as revisionist powers. You know, in the interwar period, Japan, Germany, Italy, they left the League of Nations, and what they were trying to do, they were revisionist powers because they were trying to overturn what they saw as an unjust international order. I don't see the BRICS and many of the global south like that. I see many of these BRICS countries trying to reduce Western dominations and actually to replace the West in many of these institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN. So that's why I'm so skeptical sometimes of countries like India and others when they talk in the name of BRICS, but they're really pursuing very parochial and self-interested policies. Even China, I think, is not necessarily in favor of kind of spreading prosperity. China is about primarily itself, but there's still room to maneuver within that. In terms of global south contributing to peace through different religions, I don't think the fact that countries have different religions means that they cannot work together. That's the whole point of the United Nations. So you don't necessarily have to have the same religion to be able to fight for some of the same battles. That's my short answer to that. How can the North help the South? If I look at Africa, one of the most important things about helping Africa is 80% of the United Nations peacekeepers are in Africa, and 60% of the discussions in Africa, but there isn't enough support financially and logistically for African regional organizations to be able to develop their capacity to keep peace. That is one concrete suggestion, I would say. And then the final question on slavery and why is the West only just waking up? I mean, the West has always assumed, just like a lot of rich people in society that may have inherited wealth, or in the South African case, a lot of white people think that a lot of their wealth and success is due somehow to them, and that blacks are just being lazy. They don't look at the historical context of providing them inferior Bantu education, oppressing them through apartheid, stealing the best land in the country, etc. So it's the same kind of thing. The Western industrialization and success was based basically on 4 centuries of free slave labor. But not many countries are prepared to recognize that. And they're certainly not prepared to recognize that these are crimes against humanity in case there's an obligation on them to then pay and repair that harm. But you've seen in recent cases, Germany has now apologized for the Namibian genocide and agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros. The Dutch have apologized for slavery in the Caribbean and the Antilles, and they've set up a fund of 200 million euros to look at ways of repairing some of that damage. The Church of England, Lloyd's, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, a lot of them are recognizing this, and it's not just a matter of paying money. You can also develop schemes like scholarships and all sorts of other schemes that can benefit groups who were descended from that, because COVID showed us that even though slavery ended in America in 1865, the effects of slavery in terms of the inequalities that still exist even today in America are still very much with us.
That's okay. Okay. So there are many questions. I'm not going to be answering all of them. We don't have that much time, so I'm going to be picking up some of the questions that seems more important to me and more in my field. The first question that I am going to be picking up is this question on religion and the importance of religion, which I also mentioned when I was basically trying to answer this question on Africa. In which, for example, the religion of Turkey, being a Muslim majority country, really has become this influential factor when trading with Africa or using its soft power tools in Africa. For example, when I checked the data, Turkey has now more than 200 schools in Africa in 25 countries. And these has become very popular, basically, schools. These are good schools. Probably, I have never been to one of them, but one of the things that is very attractive, that makes the schools very attractive to the African population is that these are basically Muslim-oriented schools, right? They are not, the education is not religiously oriented, but there's this component of that. So I think this cultural connection has become more and more important in the last 2 decades. And I do think that there has been, not only in Muslim-majority countries, not only in other, like in different cultures in Latin America, but also in Europe, there has been a civilizational turn in that sense, where we have been, focusing more on values, however defined. And these values could be civic values sometimes, and those civic values could be considered different from Muslim values or, values from that the countries like Turkey had. But what we have been witnessing, whether it is the problem of refugees, migration, whether it's the problem of institutionalization and this and that, we have been really seeing a lot of emphasis on religion, values, both in domestic politics and in external conflicts. So this is one. The second thing about is the question that I'm going to picking up is I will try to respond is this conflict between China and the U.S. And I agree to what has just been said, that the U.S. hegemony may be declining, but it is not over. We are not going to be shifting towards Westlessness or post-Western social order soon. It may happen, but not soon. And that's not only because the United States has the economic primacy, but it also has the military primacy. I mean, when you compare the military expenditures of China and the United States, the United States has spends 40% of the global military expenditures and military bases in 80 countries. And for China, it's really little. Maybe 70% of the the military expenses, it's basically done by China, and not many, maybe 4 military bases, as far as I remember, outside of China. So United States is definitely still a major military power, and it's not going to be replaced by China soon. But what is more important to me in this debate is this fact that the challenge towards U.S. primacy is basically coming from domestic front, from the U.S. electorate, right? More inward-looking U.S. electorate that we have been witnessing, more semi-isolationist stance that the U.S. electorate has been pursuing in the last decade or so. And I do think that this is related again to the distribution or inequality within the United States as well, or the decline of the middle classes, or if you look at the campaign promises of Trump, deindustrialization and reindustrialization. But I think who is going to win this competition between China and the United States is related to this question of which model, either the Chinese model or the Western model, is going to be better in redistributing wealth, right? So I think that question is really the primary question. Which model is going to be redistributing wealth to its own citizens in a better way? So they are competing in that sense. And it boils down to that. I mean, the questions that are also asked by the Global South in terms of inequality, redistribution, and this and that is also related to this question of inequality. What type of a model, both at the internal domestic level and global level, we should have that would redistribute wealth much better in a way than we used to have. So we have, we need to deal with this question, I guess, and I'll stop here.
Thank you. You're American, so you have the last word, like always, you know.
I think that the beauty of American is that if I had the first word, I'd be accused to be having the first word. And if I have the last word, one would be accused of having the last one. But we're used to it, so it's quite okay, first or last. There is a, first of all, fantastic question. I'm glad that the young folks woke up by the end of it and started asking questions. So that was great. There is a trend, or at least an underlying theme, of looking for a messiah somewhere. Some place has got a good model, and if they could just come and save us, whether it be China, whether it be the South, whether it be some other country that's going to come and do it. Either we are all the same or we are not. We are all the same. America's made its share of mistakes. If you gave me absolute power, I am corrupted. It doesn't make a darn difference if I'm from America or South Africa or Togo. So we all have our same ills, and there are. So there are nobody better one way or the other. So in our system is that we can either trust some grand person's going to come up with some grand idea, or we believe in each other and some checks and balances so we make sure nobody goes too far off in either respect where you're from. So I would ask for, take what you can do and look at a positive way to make the world a better one, as opposed to dividing the world. The other thing is we are dividing a lot. We are this with America, with China, the South, the North, any case. So these are the broad things, but I'm going to quickly run through the points that were made. I'm not sure what the point was about religion, other than we have various different religions, whether it's even within the northern ends, we have different religions, so that's not an issue. But there are three things which are sort of interesting when you look at the religious side of stuff. One, three broad themes. One, I think so-called West or transatlantic is becoming more secular, certainly Europe and certainly America, even though different in different ways. Africa is still a more conservative brand of religion, certainly. And then we have a little bit of a mixed bag in Latin America. So that's an interesting theme. It makes a bigger issue, as my good friend said. But that does not prevent Africa to have the trading partner with the country like China, which actually is about as anti-religious as you can get. Not only does not allow for religion, is the only country where your pope has to seek the permission of the government to appoint a cardinal. It actually lists people by religion to say whether they are insurrectionist or they could be a terrorist or not. God forbid you're a Tibetan and you're listed. So I think it doesn't prevent it. On the positive note, one of the countries that I actually saw religion work together, which I've never seen anywhere else, is Tanzania. And a lot of that goes to Nyerere. I mean, they don't even do a census by sort of how many Muslims, how many Christians. It may be a half-half. You don't know because they don't count it that way. The president goes one way or the other. And if you want to see an example where you walk into a place and you do not know whether you're sitting with a Christian or a Muslim, even with their name sometimes, that's a remarkable thing. I mean, I've never seen, it's a remarkable example for anywhere in the world. Now, there are issues now with missing that boat with the way they are treating not only how Zanzibar situation comes in. So there's a lot of tricky thing in religion. Once you open that issue, we can spend pretty much the whole conference on it. I think the two broad other themes that came up related to China. One was, when is China going to dethrone America and the world's going to be a better one? My good friend here. And the back over there, that there's a lot going on in Africa, how we deal with it. Again, if somebody didn't so much care about respect and equality and dignity, I care a lot about that. So I think if there is, from the African perspective, a better model to work with China, have at it. I think you may find that the issues may be slightly more onerous as they go through deal after deal after deal, whether it be a debt issue, whether it be a strategic resources issue, whether it be a strategic port issue. But if that works out, God bless you, have at it. I mean, so we'll see how that particular playing out. If people think a lot about how great China is, one should ask their neighbors. If you welcome in, they'll give you a better idea when you're living in the neighborhood than from afar, loving Chinese model. So that's, but it works for you, have at it, no problem on that end. I think the issue here was mentioned to some degree that, you know, we're not defining the global south. We're talking about dignity and other things. I really don't think it's my job to define the global south. I just think, again, looking for peace or something like that from the global south, we've got, as my good friend said, a lot more battles and wars and disputes going on in global south than even though we get the bigger picture with the Ukraine and somebody mentioned. I mean, we've got issues, really very strong stuff going on South Sudan. We've got my good friend mentioned out there in northern Mozambique. So we have a lot of issues out ad infinitum. So if you're looking for somehow a peace resolution coming from them, that's an interesting point of view. The lady here answered your point a little bit by saying, how is Global South going to do it? They got all these issues going on within it. That is true. Doesn't make them weaker or worse than us, but surely doesn't make any better than us. All of us have similar issues that we try to deal with it and work through within the given context. Why did it take it so long to figure out that slavery was a bad idea? I mean, I think throughout humanity, we can again look at different aspects of it. There were a lot of people, and if you're going to look at that stuff, while it was happening, who were big critics of it, both in America and in Europe. And I think it started off very badly, but in an industrial way, as a good friend said, that it's already there in Africa before Europe's got there. But there was a business industrial model to this, dealt with having colonies, the need for labor. It came up and it died a little bit economically as well because the model died. So there is ups and downs of it, and we have various elements when we make the economic argument, and we have sort of a lag in political and sort of moralistic rationalization of it. So that's not one unique situation. There are several other elements that come through within that same framework as well. A lot of other points, without going too much into detail, I think I've covered most of them in generic way. Oh, I mean, decline of America. Love that one, that's always. So we've been hearing that since 1776, so I think there'll be a while, and I look for decline of America. First it was the Europeans who were looking for it, then Japan was looking for it, China looking for it, I think a bunch of fruits. So absolutely, we believe in competition, bring it on, it's fine, I think it's fantastic. All of us sort of look and go for it. The point, as my good friend mentioned about China and US, so the question is one of economy and economic model that was brought up. The Chinese, I mean, I think one of the sad aspects of Chinese economy, Deng Xiaoping's practicality and pragmatism to allow for a Chinese model to continue. So in 1989, and particularly Xi coming in, a Communist Party control over its growing economy. So right now, if you happen to be a CEO of a Chinese company with global ambitions, whether it be Alibaba or something else, the biggest problem is coming from the Chinese Communist Party, not from anything else. So I think those are internal issues that China has to deal with structurally before it sort of goes off in a much wider situation. The military stuff, yes, the numbers are higher on our end, but we're not terribly efficient on it. So part of the reason our numbers are that much high is that it's really expensive to build stuff in America than they do in China. So if you corrected that, just like you do with purchasing power stuff, it'll be a little bit more parity. China has a bigger navy today than the United States does. So again, different numbers may lead you to different places, but that's not the broader theme. Think for yourself, keep a positive attitude, and treat everybody with dignity and respect. And I think we can go for a better world without looking backwards all the time and litigating what happened, what didn't happen, not to forget it. Certainly in Europe, one should never forget the past. Certainly in this part of the world, one should never forget past. When somebody comes down the road and tells you, I know how the world works better than you do, you should really watch yourself. Don't trust that person at all, whether it comes from America or China or Global South. Think for yourself and make sure that you put checks and balances before you go too much down that road. This Europe has done so more than one occasion and paid for it. Let's not repeat it in some version of Global South on that element. Thanks.
Sorry, Chair. I just want to say a very quick comment.
Very short. Very short. Very short.
You said that we should ask China's neighbors what they think about China. But you know what America's Latin American neighbors used to say? We're so close to America and so far from God.
Okay. Well,
I don't think a good Catholic would say that, and most of them are Catholic. But I think the point was to get the last word.
Yes.
So I'm sorry. I give it back to you. You can have it.
I will have the last word in saying that there will be no conclusion. This is an open debate. I'm surprised that we didn't mention democracy and human rights. I thought it would come up very rapidly. It did not, so this will be a pretext for a new session. Well, just thank you, the three of you. You have made a long trip to Normandy, so thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And thank you for the audience, because I'm struck that you all took notes and asked good questions. So this shows that this Forum Mondial will go on and be repeated on a yearly basis. Thank you very much.